Hello. By way of introduction, my name is Suzanne Walker. I'm from Beaverton. My interest in family history began when I was 4 or 5 years old and heard my grandfather refer to his mother, Bridget Doyle. I asked where she was and why I didn't know her. Of course, she'd been long deceased, but in my child's mind I conjured up images of her. Years later, while looking at her name on a census page for the first time, I experienced the thrill of discovering more about a loved one I never knew. Since that time, I have uncovered names and information on thousands of other family members from both Ireland and Eastern Europe. It has been a privilege to meet distant family members from these other places and to share the information about our common ancestors. Let's move on to the presentation. This is about DNA testing, and I'm going to let Donald Rumsfeld introduce our topic today. Quote, "As we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know." And that pertains very well to DNA testing because it's full of surprising information and sometimes rather shocking information, but it's also exciting to uncover new information about our own selves, our backgrounds. I assume that everyone watching this class has either taken a DNA test and wants more understanding, or is considering taking a test and would like to investigate the types of tests and the implications of testing. Let's look at 3 important questions everyone should ask before participating in DNA testing, and which we will address in the next hour. First, ask yourself, do I really want to know my heritage, ethnicity, and possible genetic risks? Once you have seen the results of your DNA test, you cannot unsee them. For those who are listening, I assume the answer to this first question is very likely yes. Second, am I prepared to accept the results? You may or may not like what you see. The results may not jive with the research you have already done. Remember, though, that DNA is science, and science doesn't lie. In a moment, we will look at some real-life cases that demonstrate unexpected results. And third, how will others in my family react to the information revealed in a DNA test? Though the gloomy predictions that you might find an axe murderer in the family are vastly overstated, it is important to carefully think through the effect your test could have on others. A few years ago, an expert said, "In 10 years, there will be no more skeletons in the closet." In my opinion, the closet door has burst open and a lot of old, forgotten junk is spilling out all over the floor, messing up clean and tidy lives. Remember, though, that DNA results are not just about you. I would like to briefly refer to 3 cases pertaining to DNA test results that I am personally acquainted with. These 3 cases will make some of you think twice about testing, but later we will talk about the glorious, amazing, and wonderful aspects of DNA testing. So forgive me for starting out on a little bit of a negative note, but I want you all to be aware of some of the possibilities. Let's talk first about Tammy. Tammy is an in-law of mine, and here's her basic family. Of course, I've changed the names, and the pictures I show you are not really the pictures of the people, obviously. So you'll see Tammy on the screen, and then her mother, Ruth Jones, is in italics, and that's because it's Ruth Jones' line that we're going to be concerning ourselves with here right now. So Tammy's mother, Ruth Jones, was married to Jim Wilson, who was Tammy's birth father. But Jim Wilson left the family before Tammy was born, and eventually Ruth Jones remarried to someone else. Tammy grew up knowing that Jim Wilson was her biological father, though he was never part of her life. A few months ago, Tammy received her DNA test results and right away noticed that there were no matching relatives on her Wilson side. So that was puzzling to her. So she did some research and contacted some of the matches that she had that appeared to be from her paternal side. And then she discovered her biological father was not Jim Wilson. When she was, let me go to the next slide here. When she was talking to me on the phone, telling me this experience, and I asked her, so what is the name of your biological father? And when she said it, I blurted it right back at her. Tom Reagan, I know who that is. You could have knocked me over with a feather. Growing up, I lived in a small town that was a popular setting used by movie companies to film westerns, and Tom owned a movie ranch in town. He rubbed shoulders with John Wayne, James Arness, and tons of other names you would recognize. He allowed children to play at the movie ranch if they stayed out of the way. My younger sisters got a kick out of sitting on the buffalo that he kept in a pen. The odd thing is that Tammy now lives in that same town about 3 miles from where Tom's movie ranch once was. After Tammy got used to the shocking revelation about her who was her bio father, she called her mother and asked, "Mom, does the name Tom Reagan mean anything to you?" Her mother's quick reply, "Oh, yeah." Tammy was the result of a 1-month relationship her mother had with Tom. And apparently Tom got around. Tammy has located not only the children of Tom's marriages, but has found children stemming from other short relationships. So how has Tammy and her family adjusted to this unexpected bombshell? Fortunately, her mother took the news well that Tammy had unlocked her 60-year secret. The effect on her siblings was slightly awkward for a short time, as they had to adjust to the idea that she was not biologically their full sister, but now their half-sister. But they all insist it does not matter in the least. What remains to be seen is whether this knowledge colors the children's relationship with their mother. They know something about their mother now that was not known previously. I have said many times, the number one rule in family history is to forgive your ancestors. Tammy and her siblings don't know what their mother's life was like after Mr. Wilson abandoned her and the children so many years ago. She made choices we can never fully understand, and 60 years have passed, and their mother is still the loving parent they have revered for so long. But let's keep that in mind, that we can't be the judge of our ancestors. We don't know their lives, and we can't understand their circumstances fully. Let's move on to Kathryn. So again, here's Kathryn. Her mother, Margie Fisher, was married to Michael Bond, and his name is in italics because that's the line we'll be looking at. So I've known Kathryn for decades. She's an avid family historian, and we often compare notes or ask the other for ideas on where to go next in our research. A couple of months ago, Kathryn called me late one night in a distressed state. She could hardly get her words put together and finally managed to say that a stranger had emailed her with the news that he was her half-brother from her father's side. So here we have Kathryn with her mother, Margie Fisher, excuse me for a second, her father, Michael Bond, and then Kathryn, but Michael Bond had a relationship with an unknown woman and had a child, Robert. So Kathryn had this message from this man, Robert, that he was her half-brother. She was astounded because she just knew her dad would never have had a relationship with anyone besides her mother, and she went on about all the reasons this couldn't possibly be true, yet there he was in her DNA match list with the right amount of Centrimorgans to be her half-sibling. It took about an hour for me to talk her off the ledge. Eventually, she accepted that she couldn't possibly know anything about her father's activities before her birth, and that it was important to remember what an excellent father he had been. She was absolutely positive that her father would have supported this child, as that's the kind of man he was. This may be true, but it's entirely possible that I lost my place here. It's entirely possible that he didn't know about the child, or that he did support him without anyone else knowing a thing about it. Well, it turns out the child was adopted out through an orphanage at about 18 months of age to a loving family, and Kathryn will never know for sure the circumstances of her newly known brother's birth. Linda is another friend of mine who had a surprising experience with DNA testing. She happens to be my neighbor, and a while back she tested and recognized that something wasn't right in her results. She saw no matches from her maternal grandfather's side of the family. So here's Linda, her father, his side of the family, and then her mother in italics, along with her, that's her grandfather, and then her grandmother, Sarah Davis. She then asked her mother to test, and the results sent them both reeling because her mother had no matches with her own father's side. So Linda's mother was clearly not the biological daughter of her own father, which would be Linda's grandfather. So the man who raised her was not her biofather, her mother's biofather. Linda dove right into researching DNA on her mother's side of the family then. Using triangulation and by contacting matches, Linda was able to pinpoint a surname that represented her mother's biofather, and that surname was Marley. And then Linda did some census research on that name, and she discovered that a man living next door to her grandmother, Sarah Davis, was a Mr. Marley. In fact, there was not one Mr. Marley in the household next door to Sarah Davis, but there were two Mr. Marleys. One was about 60 years old and the other was in his 20s, father and son. So the last time I talked to Linda, she had not determined which Mr. Marley is the biological father of her mother, but she was on the track for that, and this was a hard one for her. She and her mother both. It's kind of a grieving process, finding out that something you thought was true your entire life was actually not true, although her mother was raised by a loving father, but she just happens to not be the bio daughter of that man. Just so you know, Ancestry estimates that every year about 7,000 people find out that they are someone else's biological child. Well-known molecular genealogist C.C. Moore says, people shouldn't look at this as pure entertainment because it is about our identity, and our identity can be very complex, more so than we might believe. And so her point is well taken because, you know, a lot of us get the kit for our birthday or Christmas or something like that, and that's okay, but we do need to put some thought into this. So up to this point, you have heard some negatives about DNA testing, skeletons falling out of the closet, if you will. All cautions aside, for me and those in my family who have tested, the results have been exciting and only a little bit surprising. My 45 years of research shows that I am split down the middle, 50% Irish from my 100% Irish mother, and 50% Carpatho-Rusyn from my 100% Rusyn father. My DNA test results have been closely aligned with those ethnic groups, and I did not anticipate 3% Baltic and 2% Norway in there. My children are more of what you could call a Heinz 57 because my husband is a mix of multiple ethnicities. It has been fascinating to compare results and to see distant family popping up in our matches. Let's talk about the wonderful world of DNA testing. First, the main thing that people enjoy about DNA testing is that they discover their ethnicity and family heritage. You can also identify health and genetic risks depending on which company you use. You can make connections with relatives of all distances. You can break down brick walls, and you can leave a legacy by leaving your DNA test results behind. Let's talk about discovering ethnicity and family heritage. I'm going to use an example from my own family to define what this actually means. First of all, haven't you wondered what makes you, you? Ethnicity is what makes you, you. It's one of the factors. Ethnicity can be defined as a group of people who identify with each other through a common and distinctive culture, including language, religion and values, history, a homeland, food, and a myriad of traditions. This is different from race. Race focuses on observable physical traits such as white, black, Asian, Hawaiian, and so on. You can actually, if you noticed on the census this year in 2020, that you can actually choose the race that you belong to. You can also, you can choose the ethnicity you belong to, but not the race you belong to. My Carpatho-Rusin side is an example of both ethnicity, heritage, and nationality. So this is a group of people who never had their own homeland or their own country, and they are spread among 4 different countries. So you can see at the top of the map is Poland, to the right is the Ukraine, and then Slovakia is kind of in the middle, and then Romania down on the lower right also has Carpatho-Rusin people. So this is an ethnic group that is spread among 4 different countries. And so that's also where nationality comes in. So family heritage incorporates ethnicity and also includes elements of whatever nationality you are. So let's further distinguish between ethnicity and nationality. Nationality refers to the political borders in which your family lived, whereas ethnicity transcends borders. For example, my friend Victoria's ethnicity is German, but her family lived in what is now Romania for over 200 years. Thus, their nationality was Romanian, their ethnicity is German, and their celebrated heritage includes German and Romanian traditions. This slide just shows some of the fun aspects of the Carpatho-Rusin traditions with wooden churches. Those are Byzantine Catholic churches. Pizanke, which is decorating what is commonly called Ukrainian Easter eggs. And then each village has its own costumes, and sometimes they look similar, but their embroidery can be different, and they're very into singing and dancing and that kind of thing. It's a lot of fun. The second feature offered by DNA testing companies is information about your health and your genetic risks, and also your physical traits such as eye color and so on. More companies are offering this service. Ancestry started recently, and 23andMe has been doing this for years, and there may be others that do it as well. Most of it amounts to finding out that you're at a slightly greater risk or a lesser risk of developing certain diseases or certain conditions. Some companies help you understand your traits such as eye color or sensitivity to cilantro, which is a genetic trait. And there are other interesting characteristics all based on your DNA. So if this type of information is important to you, be sure to seek out a company that focuses on these things. 23andMe is a good one for that in my own experience. Okay, let's go back. We've talked about, let's go back to our other slide. We've talked about ethnicity and family heritage. We've identified health, talked about identifying health and genetic risks. Let's talk about making connections. This is a sample page from Ancestry's matching page where you can see your DNA matches, and they start with your closest matches such as parent and child, and they list those, and then they go to siblings, and then they go to what they call close family, which can be cousins or aunts and uncles and that kind of thing. So you can opt out of this feature if you're not interested in making connections with other people that share your DNA. You can opt out of this, and then no one will see you on their match list. You just won't be there. But I imagine that most people who are at a family history conference are probably interested in DNA matching. You might think you know pretty much who all your cousins are, but you don't. You'll find that you have a list of thousands, and you'll have to pick and choose which ones you want to contact for more information. I found this part of my DNA test results to be a lot of fun. I've been in contact with people who I knew who they were, and maybe I met them when I was a little kid, maybe they're third or fourth cousins or something, and then we get back in touch and share information. Out of all of the ones I've contacted, I have only had one negative experience, and that involved a man named Timothy. When I saw him on my match list, I knew exactly where he fit in and how we were related. We were fourth cousins. And so I contacted him to get more information or to share information. I wanted to send him what I had and see what he had. But I I happened to look at his Ancestry family tree that he had created, and it was a complete disaster. It was such a mess, and he had missing generations where he'd skipped generations. So he showed people as children of their grandparents. He'd skipped like the parents' generation, and then with my own particular family, he had moved some of my father's siblings to different parents. So when I contacted him, I tried to be low key about it, and I said, I see that you have my Uncle John and my Aunt Mary with the wrong parents, and so on. And so he wrote back, and he said he went ahead and fixed that. And then I gradually told him a few other things, like there's a missing generation in here, and then he nobody likes to be contacted and told they're doing it wrong. And I'm not saying I've never made a mistake, but his was really bad. And so eventually he got kind of defensive, and he started saying he had it right and I had it wrong, and I didn't know how to do it, and so on and so forth. And so finally I in one email exchange, I said, so you're telling me that for 60 years I have been visiting the wrong family in Pennsylvania, and that my dad visited the wrong family in Pennsylvania? And he said, yep, that's right. So in other words, in his mind, my dad was visiting the wrong parents, and I was visiting the wrong grandparents and the wrong cousins. So I just finally said, I don't think we can help each other. And so he's contacted me a few times since, but I just don't answer. Otherwise, other than that, I've had a great time contacting people and being contacted by others and sharing photos and information. So I recommend this feature, and all of the DNA testing services offer some degree of matching. Let's talk for just a moment about Centrimorgans. If I go back to this slide where we have DNA matches, down here under each defined relationship, you'll see where it says shared DNA, and under this one, 3,465 cm across 43 segments. So this is a scientific explanation of how the company determines how closely related you are to other people. So Centrimorgans, the CM represents Centrimorgans, and Centrimorgans are a measure of genetic linkage. So when you have a DNA match, it means that you and your match inherited DNA from a common ancestor. The higher the number of shared Centrimorgans, the closer the relationship. Parent and child will share about 3,400 Centrimorgans. Siblings will share about 2,500 Centrimorgans. A niece and nephew relationship or an aunt-uncle relationship share about 1,600 centimorgans. However, at this point it gets a little bit complicated because grandparents and grandchildren also share that amount, as do half-siblings. First cousins share about 775 centimorgans, as do great-grandparents and great-grandchildren, and so on. So sometimes people are bothered because a program will show their relationship as a nephew or niece instead of aunt, uncle, or vice versa. And that's because those relationships you share the same amount of centimorgans with a niece or nephew as you do with an aunt or uncle. And so the program doesn't know which one of those it is. And so keep that in mind when you're looking at your relationships. And if they don't look quite right, this is why. It's because the program is showing you the results based on the number of centimorgans that you share. And it has no way of knowing if that person is your niece or nephew or instead an aunt and uncle. I hope that makes sense. So I guess you could sum it up by saying that it can be said that the number of centimorgans defines a degree of relationship. Okay, let's talk about breaking down brick walls, which is another advantage of DNA testing. So I'm going to use my own experience here because it was really quite astounding to me. I never expected to knock down a long-standing brick wall through my Ancestry DNA test. So here's my Ancestry bombshell. First, let me give you some background. My formal research began when I was a teenager, and right from the start, I learned from relatives that our Irish had come from the Dingle Peninsula, and that is an area in the very furthest southwest part of Ireland. So I began a many years correspondence with the parish clerk of the Dingle parish, and his name was Padraig Lynch. He was willing to look deep into the books to find my people. By the time I made my first visit to Dingle in 1976, we had built up a good rapport, so much so that he allowed me to peruse the parish books myself. I had such fun following my lines through the books, but I noticed that one of my surnames was not in the Dingle parish books at all, and that was my Toomey line. Padraig Lynch told me that Toomey was not a County Kerry name and that I would be wise to search for them in County Cork. Over the following decades, I researched again, and I researched again for my Toomeys in County Cork, but came up with nothing. There isn't time to tell you all the steps I took to locate my Toomey family, but I dove deep and I got no results. Enter my Ancestry DNA test. Now, DNA testing has improved a lot in the years since consumer DNA testing began. So some years ago, the results were rather general. So I already knew that my Irish were from West Kerry, as indicated on my DNA map that when I first did a DNA test or an ancestry test about 4 or 5 years ago. As Ancestry increased their number of samples, the patrons' results narrowed, becoming more specific. After a while, the Ancestry map for my DNA had a circle around the Dingle Peninsula. Instead of just a big circle around Ireland or a big circle around County Kerry, the circle was around the Dingle Peninsula. And I already knew that was the origin for all except for my Toomey line. On a later update, there was even a more specific circle around my great-grandfather's farm on the Dingle Peninsula. But still, there was nothing about the Toomeys in County Cork. So then, about a year ago, I opened up my Ancestry DNA test to look, and there had been an update. And when I saw this map, I let out an audible gasp because there was a tiny or a fairly small circle, and I'm going to move my mouse over that. This fairly small circle right there, this is County Cork, starts right down the middle of this peninsula here. And here was this circle. So the northern part of the circle was County Kerry, and the southern part was County Cork. And up here is the Dingle Peninsula, where I already have known for many, many years that my family came from there. And I've visited there 3 times and met relatives and seen where my ancestors came from. But down here, this was new as of a year ago. So I was really, really excited because I knew for a fact that this was pertained to my Toomey family. So as soon as I saw that, I went to the parish records. I felt like the pot of gold had appeared, and I researched the parish. There's a parish called Adrigal that's on that peninsula on the southern part in County Cork. And so I researched that parish, and I found right away, my third great-grandparents. They married in 1833 and had children there. And so I don't know if I would have found that without. I may have found them in the parish records, which I had checked over the years, and they were not available for that area, but now they are. But their names are common enough in County Cork that I may not have known for sure that that was the right family. But with that circle around that area of Adrigal, I know for a fact that that's where my Toomeys came from. And they, this summer, we actually have a trip planned to visit that parish. And that it looks like that is probably not going to happen, but we will go at some point. So that was an exciting bombshell for me. Okay, so going back, I'm going to flip back for a second to our chart here. Okay, we've talked about the first 4 things. Now let's talk about leaving a legacy. Let's go back down. So many of you, it's very common for people doing their family history to have inherited photos or diaries, furniture, valuables, letters, and even personal histories from ancestors. But not all of us have had that happen. And so that makes me kind of sad. In my family, I have some lines that I've never even seen photos of my great-grandparents. And so that's kind of sad. And what I would give for those things would be a lot. I would give a lot to have photos or something from those ancestors. So I got to thinking one day that leaving your DNA results behind when you leave this earth is kind of like leaving a legacy, where you might leave your personal history or some other precious item to your descendants. You can leave your DNA results, and that's part of your legacy to your family. You are actually leaving them a roadmap to their own ancestry, besides the research that you've done. So think about that when you're considering taking a DNA test. Okay, so let's move on a little bit from the positives of DNA testing, and I just want to mention that not a week goes by that I don't see some kind of article about DNA testing, either in the Oregonian or a magazine or something, where there are these crazy stories about how somebody thought they were 100% Irish and they found out they were 50% Jewish, or maybe their grandparents, figured out that they had been switched at birth. I've really absolutely read articles like that, where long lost siblings found each other through their DNA testing. And so a lot of these are really great things. So what I've done is, just for fun, I have compiled several page document that has links to some of these stories, that if you enjoy this kind of thing and want to read it, this will be posted on the website for this conference, and you can take a look at some of those if you'd like. Okay, so let's go into learning about the types of DNA testing. So we're getting a little more into the science. We're not going to go deep into the science because we don't need to do that for this kind of class. But I do want you to understand what you're getting with a test when you buy each test. So the first kind of testing I want to talk about is called autosomal DNA testing, autosomal testing. This is the most common, and it's the best test for genealogical purposes. So autosomal chromosomes are the 22 pairs that every human has, and these are what's tested in an autosomal DNA test. This test is most accurate in detecting closer relationships. Estimates are that it's about 90+% accurate in detecting third cousins, and then it goes down from there to 45 to 50% in detecting fourth cousins, and so on. So its value is mostly in establishing relationships in the first 5 generations of your family going back, which is to your third great grandparents. All of the companies do autosomal DNA. So if you buy an Ancestry DNA kit, this is what you're getting. The same with any of these others, but they do offer other kinds of testing, which I'll mention in just a moment. Every one of them also, through autosomal DNA, provides like the map I showed you of my own DNA results in Ireland. Those all provide some kind of map to your ethnicity. So, and that comes from an autosomal DNA test. Then there's mitochondrial DNA. It's called mtDNA. And mitochondrial DNA is carried by the mother, and she passes it on to all of her children, male or female. And a mitochondrial DNA test will show you your direct maternal ancestry going mother to mother to mother to mother, as indicated on the right-hand side of this chart. And since men and women both carry their mother's mitochondrial DNA, if you're interested in this kind of test, it can be done by a son or daughter of the line that you want to follow. So because mitochondrial DNA does not recombine, it can remain unchanged for thousands of years. And so this test, it's going to look different from your autosomal DNA test. It's not going to be the same where you have all the people matching and that kind of thing, but it will provide some information that might be useful to you. So this does not come in just the standard test that you're getting when you purchase a test from a company. You have to find a company that does mtDNA testing. So I know 23andMe does, but there are others that do. Ancestry does not. Okay, and then similarly, there is a test called a Y-DNA test, and only males can do this because only males have a Y chromosome. But it's the same idea where you can go father to father to father in getting that paternal line. So Y-DNA traces a man's direct paternal line, and this is valuable if you want to prove or disprove a relationship to another man with the same surname, no matter how distant the relationship might be. Let me give you an example. My husband's cousin in Texas was studying her Sellers line, and there were a lot of Sellers in the area, and from the research she'd done, she was pretty sure that some of them were not related to her Sellers line. But the way she decided to prove that was she got about 20 men surnamed Sellers to take a Y-DNA test. So she chose men from her own Sellers line where she knew that they belonged to that line, and then she asked some of the Sellers who belonged to lines she wasn't sure about. The results indicated that she did indeed have 2 unrelated Sellers groups. A larger number of the men had Y-DNA identical to her Sellers' male relatives, and the other group had different Y-DNA, showing they did not share a common Sellers ancestor with the first group. Now, what if you want to know the Y-DNA line or the mitochondrial DNA line that is not your direct line? So, for example, if I wanted to know the mitochondrial DNA of my second great-grandmother, Mary Murphy, I am directly descended from her, but not on the female line. So if I did a mitochondrial DNA test, it would not include her line. So I could ask her great-granddaughter, Joanne, to test, because Joanne is a direct descendant of Mary Murphy on the female line. And so she could do that for me if I asked her to. It would work the same way if I wanted to know the Y-DNA results for a male ancestor of mine. I could ask a male cousin who is a direct descendant of the ancestor that I wanted to know about. Let's clear the air about a common misunderstanding of DNA testing. Except for identical twins, DNA is different in every person who has ever lived or ever will live. Siblings will have sometimes dramatic differences in their DNA, and here is why. You inherit 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% from your father, but the DNA you receive from each one is given to you randomly. So let's look at this slide here to explain that. So at the top you see, on the left, you see Andrew and Sandra, and they have a child, Edward. And according to the diagram, Edward has 50% of his DNA from Andrew and 50% of Sandra. And again, on same thing on the right with Graham and Elaine, they have Angela, and each has given her 50% of their DNA. So then Edward and Angela have children, and there are 3 children listed, Gerald, Glenda, and Regan. And you can see that those 3 children coming from the same parents each got some of the same DNA from each parent and some different. And so they look different. They may have resemblances to each other. For instance, I see that Glenda and Regan both have the N from Angela. And then I see that Gerald and Glenda have a D from Edward. But none of them are the same. So when you hear someone say, I don't need to do a DNA test because my sister has done one, or that kind of thing, that's, if someone really wants to know what their DNA is, they are going to have to do a DNA test, because it is not going to be the same as their sibling, except for identical twins, because then they will be the same. I saw a TV program once that had identical triplets on it, and they were very cute. It was fun to see 3 people that looked exactly the same. But otherwise, random siblings are not going to have the same DNA. Okay, so let's wrap up here by just talking a little bit about some of the DNA tests that are available. This one, you've already seen this, because this is, I wanted to show you what Ancestry's ethnicity map looks like. You've already seen that. Here is one. I'm just going to show you random pictures from different companies. Here's 23andMe showing ethnicity, and they have the map and they have the chart, and then they have so much information on their website, as does Ancestry and most of the others, that you can spend hours and hours reading about what the meaning of all these things are. Let me just mention, there is a website called, there are actually 2 websites. One is called Top 10 Reviews, and one is called Smarter Hobby. And they both have looked at DNA tests and ranked them according to their strengths and weaknesses and what features each one provides. So I'm just quickly going to go through here and mention the main features of some of the well-known kits. But I suggest that every person that wants a DNA test, go ahead and Google DNA test kits and then investigate each one that comes up, and you'll find that there are differences, there are different graphics, there are different features, and you need to decide what is most important to you in testing and go from there. Okay, so this is a picture of 23andMe. Let me move my mouse down. Okay, so this is another page from 23andMe where they take traits. This particular one is eye color, and they talk about, in relation to your DNA, what you are most likely to have. So for me, it says I'm most likely to have brown or hazel eyes, and the truth is I have eyes that have a brown inner part of my eye, not the iris, but not the pupil, but around the pupil I have a brown circle, and then around the brown circle I have sort of a greenish blue circle, and so I guess that qualifies as brown or hazel, because I don't know what to call them. Sometimes in our family we call those Irish eyes, and because they come from my Irish side. My mom had them, my grandma had them, several of my children have them, and one of my siblings has them. Okay, there's the second page of the explanation about how eye color works. And this is really interesting to me to know how these things work. Okay, here's another one. This is called Living DNA. And so they have their own types of graphics and ways of ranking your ethnicity. let me go back to that one. I want to explain, I should have made a slide about this, but I didn't. But there's one thing you need to know when you're looking at different DNA companies. If you were to test with, say, 3 different DNA companies, you would get 3 different percentage results on your ethnicity. So, for example, you might be 50% something and 25% something and 25% something else on one company, and another company you might be 40% on one and 10% of another ethnicity and 50% of another ethnicity. And you would look at that and you would think that these companies are ripping you off because they don't agree, so which one is right and which ones are making this up. And I've read comments online where people really do believe the companies are just making this up. Well, the reason on your ethnicity results, the reason that the percentages are different is because each company has identified certain regions. They've broken up the earth into regions, and then they test for DNA in those regions. And the way they do that is they've gone to these different regions and they have gotten DNA samples from people who have roots in those regions that go back at least 4 generations and likely more. And then those people's DNA become the representative sample for that area. So I hope that makes sense. The samples are representative of what DNA should look like for that area, so that when you go in and do a test, if your DNA matches like mine did on the Dingle Peninsula, a very specific area of the Dingle Peninsula, that's because Ancestry once upon a time went there and got some DNA from people there, and then my DNA matches that. Now, each company has created their own regions, and so that's why your DNA is going to look different from in each company that you test with. Each one has, excuse me, each one has identified different regions, and they've also, some of them have many more regions than another. So your DNA is going to be much more specific with a company that has identified many more regions and gotten samples for those regions. So let me use Ancestry as an example. Let me go back to that one. So Ancestry has more than 1,000 regions, more than any other company. And so that's why their results can be more specific. Now, this one might not look as specific as you'd like it to be. For instance, look at the green area that shows a lot of Western Russia and Eastern Europe, and that doesn't look very specific. However, if you look in the lower left part of that green area, there's a darker green, a little bit darker green circle that goes around the borders of Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, and Poland. And that is the area kind of right in the middle of that circle. It's not really a round circle, it's kind of an oval, but right in the middle of that area is where my family, my Carpatho-Rusin family, comes from. Now, that oval is not as small as the circle you saw earlier in Ireland around the west part of the Dingle Peninsula, and the reason for that is that in Eastern Europe, Ancestry has not focused in breaking it down into as many areas as they have in some parts of the world, and I think they will eventually. But right now, they have not focused very much on Eastern Europe and Russian DNA, and have not divided that area up into very many regions. But when they do, that oval that's around the borders of those countries will become smaller, and it will probably zero right in on Eastern Slovakia, where my family comes from. So that is something you need to know, so that if you do test with different companies, do not be discouraged or suspicious of that company when your ethnic percentages don't match between companies. There's a very good and valid reason for that. So one other thing I wanted to mention, let's go back down to the end here. it's all about, to me, it's all about making connections. And so, I would encourage you to, put some thought into this. And if you think it's right for you, to go ahead and test and enjoy your results. I do want to mention that the National Society of Genetic Counselors can help you if you do have one of these bombshells that I mentioned earlier with Tammy and Linda and Kathryn. That you can call the National Society of Genetic Counselors, and they'll match you up with a counselor who can talk you through this and help you come to terms with any surprises that you might find. There are also private Facebook groups that help people that have unexpected DNA results. And so, for instance, Linda, my neighbor who had the one unexpected result, she joined one of those Facebook groups, and that helped her to work through that. So, well, I wish we were doing this in person so we could have time for a chance for questions, but here's my email. If you have any questions or if something wasn't clear, feel free to email me and I'll do my best to answer anything I can. Thanks for listening.